Welcome, everyone. Nice to see a full house again. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Snell, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator here at the Chapman. Not quite a few of you, but tonight, and if you didn't know, this is part of our series, Conversations with the Past. We do this every month. We bring in a guest speaker, and it's a monthly service that we do here at the Chapman since it is. So tonight we are going to hear from Dr. Daniel Way. Dr. Way is a native of Glens Falls and a former primary care physician with the Hudson Headwaters Health Network. He retired in 2018. Is that right?
Yeah, 17 or 18.
Somewhere around there.
It's all a blur. Yeah. I have 3 more grandchildren since then.
Well, after 30, he retired after 38 years in the medical field. And in his retirement, he has published numerous books of stories and photographs from his medical practice. They include All in a Day's Work, Never a Dull Moment, and We Were There, which is World War II stories from Adirondac's greatest generation. And he also wrote Seneca Ray Stoddard, an intimate portrait of an Adirondack legend, which is for sale in our bookshop if you're interested. Little shameless plug there.
Along with my other books.
Along with his other books, that's correct. All right, so tonight he's going to be talking about Seneca Ray Stoddard. And my joke is always that Seneca Ray Stoddard is kind of the bread and butter of the Chapman. You know, we own much of his collection. We always have his photographs in our Stoddard gallery. And so tonight's program is going to be about Stoddard's Saratoga connection to our neighbor down south a little bit, as well as delving into Stoddard's fascinating life and his enduring impact. So now I will turn it on over.
Thank you. I'm so glad that all you folks came here tonight. I would have been really strange if nobody had shown up. But when Rebecca asked me to speak to you about Seneca Ray Stoddard, it was like somebody offering a little kid a box of candy. It was like, yeah, why wouldn't I do that? So is there anybody here who doesn't know who Seneca Ray Stoddard is? Okay, that's good. Are there any real full-blown, hardcore Stoddard nerds like me here?
Well, maybe not full-blown, but
okay.
Definitely
serious. Okay, that's good. Good. Yeah. He.
Without him knowing it.
Yeah.
He
was just trying to make a buck. That's so true, and that's one of the things that we will talk about. Okay, next slide. So when most people think about Seneca Ray Stoddard, they think about him being from Glens Falls and being in the Adirondacks, largely due to his prolific public publications and so on. But to really appreciate what he was able to accomplish in his life and how unlikely his eventual success was, we have to go back to Saratoga County in the 1840s. So let's go back there. So Seneca Ray Stoddard was born in the town of Wilton in Saratoga County in 1843, and according to the county records, the Stoddard residence, which was a farm, was located on the southeast corner of, where'd my pointer go? Oh, well. Oh, okay. So yeah, you probably saw the X anyway. Anyway, that's Dimmock's Corners, and the X is on the southeast corner of Dimmock's Corners, and that's where the Stoddard residence was when Seneca Ray was born. His immediate family, his parents lived with his maternal grandparents. His mother's parents had the farm, and Seneca Ray's father, Charles, and his mother, Julia, lived with her parents. And they apparently ran a farm. And it was not an easy childhood for Seneca Ray. His older brother, Charles Eugene Stoddard, died at the age of 3 when Ray was an infant. His mother, Julia, died in 1851 when Ray was only 8 years old. He may have even lost a couple of other siblings along the way, which haven't been recorded. But, of course, back in those days, childbirth was a very dangerous thing for the mother, and childhood diseases were rampant. So it's may not be that unusual, but certainly his family had more than their share of tragedy. So his father remarried a few years after his mother was born, or died, and meanwhile his father remarried, wedding an 18-year-old Laura Cook, and she fathered Seneca Ray's half-brother Frank, and Frank survived and was the one direct family member of his that stayed with him for his whole life. So when Seneca Ray was around 10 years old, the Stoddard family still lived in Dimmock's Corners, and they stayed there until about 1854. Next. So here's a picture of the southeast corner of Dimmock's Corners. I took that picture myself a couple of years ago. It's basically right off, not far off from exit 16 on the Northway, and it's a lot of farming area. If you were able to see behind that house, there's rolling farmland that goes on and on and on. So in many ways, it's very similar to probably how it looked back when the Stoddard family lived there. I don't know. It's in the right place, yeah. And it looks old. It looks quite old, so it's possible. Next. Unfortunately, Ray's home life was chaotic due to his father Charles's apparent but unspecified mental illness. He does look a little crazy, doesn't he? But yeah. Over the next decade after leaving Dimmock's Corners, Charles moved the family repeatedly. He would buy a farm, he would run it for a while, and then he'd sell it and then find another farm and buy that somewhere else. In 1859, he moved the family from Saratoga County to a tiny little town called Hawks Hollow in Franklin County in 1859, where Seneca Ray was just old enough to begin going to school. By the time Ray was 18 years old in 1861, yeah, I guess he was 18 in 61. They moved to Troy. The Stoddard family moved to Troy, and he probably parted from a company from his father soon after. I get the impression he really wanted to get away from his father. Does anybody know what happened to his father? Apparently, he moved on to Michigan, where he was killed by a tree that he was cutting down. It pretty much squashed him, apparently. So that was the end of Charles. Okay, next. So back in 1862, during the Civil War, Ray had moved away from home to the city of Troy to learn the craft of landscape decorating with the Eaton and Gilbert car works on Green Island and Waterville. They made carriages and railroad cars, and he learned to paint well enough to paint these nice landscapes. And of course, Troy, as you may know, was a hotbed of activity for the Hudson River School of Artists. There were many famous, talented artists in that area, and although there's no written record of exactly how he interacted with them, it's clear that he learned how to become a very accomplished painter while he was there, to the point where he studied these landscapes that you see here by artists like Asher B. Duran, John Frederick Kensett, Samuel Coleman, and others. And I'm sure he not only noticed and learned how to use the paintbrush to put paint on canvas, but look at the images of these paintings, these beautiful landscapes. I think that the grandeur of these scenes that were created by his fellow artists had a big influence on his artistic energy, and he knew that these artists would take a train or a stagecoach up to Lake George to see these beautiful sights. So he heard about Lake George and he heard about Glens Falls, and eventually he thought, yeah, maybe I could go up there too. So he basically started traveling up toward Glens Falls, and it attracted him well enough that in 1865 he moved to Glens Falls. And when he came to Glens Falls, he hit the ground running. Next. So upon arrival in Glens Falls, y'all recognize this building? Yeah. That building was owned by Thomas Potter. At the time, he's probably the one who built the building. He was a merchant and an insurance agent in the city. And he offered Seneca Ray temporary lodging in that building while he was looking for some place to live permanently. It's on the corner of Elm and South Streets. And so I guess that building is going to be repurposed, but it's on the southern end of Elm Street. So that's where he started making his connections in Glens Falls. He set himself up as a landscape artist and a portrait artist. That was going to be how he was going to make a living. He also made banners, and I don't know how much money he made doing this, but Glens Falls was this was right after the Civil War. The city was booming. There's a lot of industry and a lot of energy, and there were a couple of photographers in the city at the time. George Conkey was one of them, and apparently George Conkey hired Stoddard to make a banner for his photography store or studio, and they kind of got to know each other. And Stoddard became interested in the photography. So it's most likely that George Conkey, who was mostly a studio photographer, took Stoddard under his wing and showed him how to use a stereopticon or stereographic camera that made pictures for stereopticons, which are sort of like, I guess you can flip to the next. This would be sort of like the 1800s version of Viewmaster. You remember all your Viewmasters and how much fun it was to look at the picture in 3D. So these things were very popular, and these particular kinds of scenes where you have foreground and background and so on, the depth of field becomes very vivid when you look at them through a stereopticon. So he thought, no, this is a moneymaker. So he started taking lots of pictures of Glens Falls, and he started setting himself up in his own business. So I guess it wasn't long before his photography started bringing in more revenue than his painting. Photography was, I read another book about Woolley, the photographer Woolley, who was, I think he was like 20 or 30 years younger than Stoddard, but he sort of followed in Stoddard's footsteps. And apparently in the dawn of the age of photography, where you could go get a picture taken of yourself or buy these pictures, it was just red hot. It was like, having X-ray vision or something you'd never been able to imagine before. So it was very, very exciting and very popular. And so Seneca Ray had a gift for making connections and social climbing, and I think he was well on his way. And just for good measure, by 1865, he had married Charles Potter's daughter, who happens to be my great aunt. Yes, so Seneca Ray Stoddard is my great uncle-in-law. So Stoddard was 25 years old when he married her in 1868, and she had just turned 18. Their first of two sons, Charles, was born within a year. By then, Ray was already making trips into the Adirondacks and beginning to write stories about his travels and taking lots and lots of pictures. Next. And only a few years later, Mark Twain published The Pilgrim's Progress or The Innocents Abroad. Are you familiar with that book? It was a travelogue that he wrote about his 5-month cruise in 1867 to Europe and Egypt and the Holy Land. It became the best-selling book in Mark Twain's entire career, even better selling than Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer. It was a huge worldwide spectacular success. And people could buy this book and they could read about all these exotic places that they would never see and all the whimsical stories that Twain would have written about these experiences. And so this book was quite a smash, and it was duly noted by regional authors. So there's the local version of The Innocents Abroad called Adirondack Adventures by Reverend William Murray. Any of you have heard of William Murray? He was a minister, but he was a showman, and he did these great religious gatherings and so on. And he was a writer, and he would write about his travels up through the Adirondacks. So he was sort of like the Mark Twain of the Adirondacks. And his book was a smash success too. The only problem with the book is that he didn't have any really good illustrations. He had some engravings that he somehow was able to include in the book, but didn't have any really good illustrations. But nonetheless, he made a killing on this book, and it went through many, many printings over many years. And he published it in 1869, which was, I guess, 2 years after The Innocents Abroad was published. And of course, it was not lost on Seneca Ray Stoddard that this book was very popular and successful. So it didn't take, I guess you can, sorry, flip that. Yeah, here's the Murray's book. And it went through so many printings, you can find these books easily. And they're very entertaining. Okay, next picture. So Seneca Ray thought, oh, if Adirondack Murray can write a guidebook, I'm sure I can too. So Seneca Ray Stoddard published his first guidebook in 1873. By then, he was making a name for himself. As you can see on the top there, he was listed in the 1875 Glens Falls directory as a landscape photographer, and he lived on 22 Elm Street. Have you folks seen this picture before? It's a pretty popular Stoddard picture. Now, I inherited this photograph from my grandfather, and I know who those people are.
Wow.
That is on Elm Street, and let's see here. So these two boys, this one here and this one here, are Stoddard's sons, Charles and Edward. This is my grandfather, and next to him is his older sister and his brother, and they're standing in front of 26 Elm Street, which is 2 doors down from Seneca Ray Stoddard's house. So my great-grandfather, who was the cousin of Stoddard's wife, they lived 2 doors apart. So my grandfather grew up with Stoddard's kids. And in fact, he was quoted, Stoddard was quoted in De Sormo's book about an amusing anecdote that, let's see, where's my book? Back here, yeah. So this book is what got me, made me aware of Stoddard, because my my uncle gave this book to me because he knew I liked photography. I was in my medical residency at the time, and I was amazed to read on page 154. It said, Dr. Walter Garrett was my grandfather. This is Stoddard's nephew, recalled vividly an amusing scene which happened in the early 1800s at the Stoddard home at 36 Elm Street, which was actually 26 Elm Street. The housekeeper, a much enduring woman and the recipient of many practical jokes, was often on the verge of quitting. One day, she made a large pie and put it on the kitchen windowsill to cool. Stoddard and his sons, who were roughhousing in the backyard, saw the pie and decided to subject the somewhat surly domestic to a further test of temperament. After a short huddle, the three went their separate ways. One of the boys removed the pie from its ledge. The other son returned with a large bit and bit stock, which I guess is some kind of explosive device, while the father was providing a can of gunpowder and a long fuse. The trio then made a great production out of boring a hole through the anticipatedly tough top crust of the pie, filling the fissure with black powder, and inserting a 5 or 6 foot fuse. These noisy preliminaries to the main event attracted the attention of Mrs. Stoddard and the touchy cook. Sure of an audience, the chief conspirators, with much ado, lit the fuse and sauntered, while the sons scampered to the shelter of the barn to await developments. These were not long in coming and were most audibly satisfactory. While the three held their ears and put on a convincing show of mock fright, the flame and the powder finally met. Pieces of pie and chunks of pie plate flew in several directions, followed shortly afterward by the departure of the harried housekeeper. So I was like, damn, my grandfather was quite a rascal, I guess. Anyway, so I feel like this bond and this personal connection with Stoddard just because of my great grandfather.
Question, is that view looking north?
Yes,
And you said
that house.
26 is,
Yeah, I think 26 right there. Yeah,
that house is 26.
that I think so. That house still stands, and that's the house my great grandfather lived in.
Same period of time, I'm trying to pick out which house, the same period of time, Lemuel CPC only lived at 30.
Oh,
Which would be 2 houses up, I guess.
cool. So let's see. So anyway, let's see. Just go back for a minute. So on the left there, you can see Seneca Ray Stoddard's first guidebook. It was 1873, and it was a beautiful book, very carefully done. A lot had some engravings in it and so on, but there were no photographs because it was 1873, and he hadn't yet gotten to that point where publishing photographs in books was an easy thing to do. But Murray's book, came out a few years earlier, and that one didn't have any photographs either. So now we can move ahead. But it wasn't until 1881 that he did his first guidebook of Saratoga. That was 8 years after his Lake George first edition. But he continued to publish, and update the Saratoga guidebooks all the way through. Here's an 8th edition on 1889, and there's another edition in 1899. And I brought with me my copy of Seneca Ray's Lake Champlain, Lake George, and Saratoga guidebook. Yeah, it was upside down. Half of it's upside down. But his 1881 version is a little more standardized. Next slide. So this is the inside of this book here. And what you notice is that this book, which was a Saratoga and Lake George guidebook, was printed and presented to members of the National Division of the Sons of Temperance of North America. And this is serious business. You can see he's got the officers, the Grand Division there. This was not his only contact with the Sons of Temperance. In fact, he was a major contributor and I guess one of the higher mucky mucks in the organization for years. He chaired meetings of the group and so on. So he was a serious teetotaler his entire life, which makes me think about his father. Yeah, it would certainly explain his father. Either his father became crazy and obnoxious because he was an alcoholic, or maybe he self-medicated with alcohol because he had some other psychiatric condition. There weren't a lot of tranquilizers to be had back in the 1850s and so on. But anyway, that's what makes this particular volume interesting, is that it shows his allegiance to the Sons of Temperance.
Made for a convention or something? Was that
Apparently, it was presented to the National Division of the Sons of Temperance of America. So I don't know exactly how many copies he made or how many people received this, but again, it was a big deal, and you can see there's a Saratoga Springs, New York, June. Yeah, so they must have had some big convention then. And he was right in the middle of it. Anyway, in his 1881 guidebook, the first volume, first edition, he described the earliest days of Saratoga's development. Next slide, there we go. So you look at that and you say, what the hell is that? It looks like a giant pimple or something, but apparently it's High Rock Spring in Saratoga Springs. So let's see here. He describes the springs. Let's see here. He says the village of Saratoga at present has a population of about 12,000, which in the summer season is increased probably to 3 times that amount. Its principal street is Broadway, of which any city in the world might justly be proud. A broad, beautiful elm and maple shaded avenue running through the center of the village from the plains at the south up to the gently rising spur or point of the mountain chain that terminates here. On this, near its southern end, are the principal hotels. Toward the north are smaller boarding houses and elegant private residences. So he even makes the boarding houses sound elegant. East along the lower level is the spring producing section, extending from a mile above the village south to the Congress. And although there are a few exceptional cases, the flow of mineral waters is confined principally to these limits. The avenues, drives, and walks about the beautiful village are too numerous to mention, too lovely to be described. They show the enterprise and public spirit of the citizens and undoubtedly bring back a harvest through the added beauty and attractiveness of the place. So anyway, this is High Rock Spring, and apparently it was the spring that attracted the earliest believers in spring water to the city of Saratoga Springs. Next. So in his edition, 1881 edition, he had many elaborate illustrations of the gaiety and the elaborate architecture to be found in the city. But as you can see, these are not photographs because he had not developed the technology well enough to take, high quality landscape pictures and then have them printed in a way that could be put into a book. But he was thinking about it. So let's see here. When you, on the page that has these pictures on it, he wrote, Saratoga has the largest and finest summer hotels in the world and enrolls among its visitors the beauty, fashion, and culture of the world. It comprises probably more than the elements that go to make up the ideal summer resort than any other place in this country. The village itself is exceedingly beautiful. Taste, culture, and wealth have for years combined to make Saratoga a sort of artificial Eden. Wow. Hardly anything in the whole town hints business except the business of providing pleasures, amusements, or comforts to the host, which comes solely on the business of pleasure seeking. No factories, mills, industrial enterprises, or any utilitarian purposes show themselves to the visitor, but repose, relaxation, enjoyment is suggested on every hand and seems unlimited. Sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah, no, he didn't. I'm not sure who did, but it was not him. Okay, next. So here are some more images from that same guidebook. He goes on to write, the streets are all beautifully shaded, most of them by grand old elms or maples, so that the lovers of promenading may even enjoy their stroll at midday, and with a choice of miles of sidewalk, no matter how warm the weather, with the delightful sense of protection from the summer sun that is felt in the great woods. The drives in all directions are delightful as to scenery, and some of them highly interesting on account of historical associations. Many of the roads have been improved to a degree which makes them worthy of comparison with the highways of England, and those who bring their horses may enjoy what is rarely combined in rural driving in America, good roads and picturesque scenery. If you love music, there is plenty of the best at the big hotels, Congress Park, and other places. Are you fond of dancing? You may sate yourself at the most brilliant hops the world has ever seen. Do you like the excitement of the fashionable gaming table, either as participant or looker on? Reed's Clubhouse on Union Avenue, a few steps from Congress Spring, is grand enough and wicked enough and fascinating enough to supply everything that was destroyed when gambling was stopped at Baden-Baden. I'm not sure. Was that in England, I think? The Indian encampment grounds containing the circular railway, one of the ancient features of the village, places for archery practice and rifle shooting, Indian camps with genuine Indians of various nationalities, selling Indian baskets from Germany and some of their own make, glass blowers and cutters and many other novelties, all tending to lighten one's heart and pursue at the same time will give a day or two of innocent pleasure. Are you an admirer of horse racing and its refinement? The best, most varied, and greatest running meetings in the United States, if not the world, are given in Saratoga. Let's see, a book might be filled with a list of amusements so numerous and so inviting, individually captivating, that the visitor to Saratoga, instead of puzzling his or her mind each morning what to do for the day, only finds it difficult to decide what not to do. The society at Saratoga is the society of the wide, wide world. It is thoroughly cosmopolitan. Whew, let's go. So here is his 1906 guidebook, and he had moved on to putting photographs in his books by then. But meanwhile, he also took some very nice landscapes. So let me show next slide. Now this is from the Chatham Museum collection, actually. Thanks to Bob Bale, he got me 3 or 4 beautiful pictures of Saratoga. So that's the Grand Union Hotel, and it must be pretty, it must have been there for a while. You can see how tall those trees are. So imagine if it was still there. It must be quite a sight. Next, here's the United States Hotel in Saratoga. Also from the Chapman collection. This one here is also from the Chapman collection. Next one. This is the United States Hotel Court View. That's something. Oh, there's a Victorian splendor. And lastly, here's one more from the Chapman. Let's see here. This is United States Hotel. Oops, next. So Saratoga really was a beautiful place, and so the tourism industry must have been really very lucrative. And there's probably not that's probably why he got involved in there, but also because he had his roots in Saratoga County. Here's next, Congress Hall. Look at that building. That's pretty impressive, towering over the street. This one is actually in my own collection. Next, this is the Woodlawn Park entrance, which is just a few blocks off of Broadway, which is now in downtown Saratoga. Next. So next to these hotels was Congress Park, where many of the world famous springs were and still are. Several remaining springs can still be found right in Congress Park in downtown Saratoga. And the layout of the park hasn't changed much since Stoddard's day. as you can see in these two maps of the park. The one on the left was in one of Stoddard's guidebooks, and the one on the right was a picture that I took when I was in the park exploring just a couple months ago. Hasn't changed much. Next. So here is an 1885 picture that Stoddard took of the interior of a spring house, possibly Congress Spring in Congress Park. Let's see here. He described Congress Park as follows. He said, Congress Park, connected with Congress and Columbia Spring, was opened in 1876. No park of similar dimensions in this country excels it in natural beauty or in elegance of architectural adornments. The buildings are commodious and appropriate. Electric lights render the grounds delightful as an evening resort. Miniature lakes, beautiful walks, music, a superb cafe, abundance of seats, shade, effective police supervision, perfect order, moderate prices for everything, and obligingness from everyone connected with the spring and park makes this perhaps the most delightful pleasure ground in the world. And that was the longest sentence in his book. The admission to the park is regulated by tickets, for which a moderate charge is made, but access to the springs can be had without entering the park, and the waters are served free, which is apparently what's going on here. Okay, let's see. So back in the day when there were hardly any medicines that actually did anything good, the waters of the various springs were touted as having nearly miraculous therapeutic effects. Stoddard disqualified himself as an authority in the guidebook, in his guidebook as follows. He says, as a medicine, it will be best for those who propose to use the mineral waters as a remedial agent to place themselves under the direction of some competent physician, until with his aid, they have, by studying its effects, established a rule for future guidance. The author, having a violent and unnatural attack of modesty, when faced by the necessity of writing a learned disquisition on a subject of which he knew nothing, applied to one competent to advise. The following is the result. The medical properties are almost as varied as the springs themselves. The waters are cathartic, alternative, diuretic, and tonic. Each spring holds the salts in solution in different proportions, which gives to it a peculiar virtue and adapts it more particularly to certain forms of disease. The promiscuous and continuous drinking of these waters is an objectionable practice and often results in injury. It says, waters used for cathartic effects should be taken slightly warm in sufficient quantity and an hour before breakfast. The diet may be liberal, but an abundance of vegetables should be avoided, and only those which are perfectly fresh should be used. Okay, next. Next. So here's a picture I took recently of the Hathorn Spring. I've been in Saratoga Springs many times, but I never really paid much attention to the springs. So I thought, since he wrote a book about it, I should check them out. So here's a picture I took of Hathorn Spring in downtown Saratoga. Stoddard described it as follows. The Hathorn Spring on Spring Street opposite Congress Hall is popular, and as a beverage, the water is drank at the spring more than any other, unless it be Congress Spring water. It was discovered in the fall of 1868 during the progress of excavations for the Congress Hall ballroom. This is a closer up view of the spring, and what you notice is it has seen better days, and it's pretty badly neglected, which is pretty sad. So here's Congress Spring, the way it looked back in Stoddard's day. Here's the way it looks now. Not quite as elegant. Let's see, page 43. So here's how he described Congress Spring. Congress Spring is the oldest known in Saratoga, except for the High Rock, which is the one I showed you that looked like a giant anthill. and was discovered in 1792, just 300 years after America, which is a good thing to remember. And to it, probably more than all else, is Saratoga, indebted for its present prosperity and worldwide fame. It is one of the most famous mineral springs in the world. It is an aperient or cathartic water, highly carbonated, of agreeable taste, improving and invigorating the appetite and general health. It's starting to sound like a doctor a little bit, isn't he? Its medicinal effects have been tested for nearly a century, and its use prescribed by physicians with the utmost confidence after long knowledge of its great efficacy and the entire comfort and safety with which it may be used. To professional men and others whose occupations are sedentary, and to all sufferers from the various forms of bilious disorders, it is invaluable. The water in the bottles is sold at almost every respectable drugstore in the world. And to call for Congress water at a drug counter has become as much as to say Saratoga water. So that's Congress Spring. Now there's Columbian Spring, which, as you can see, was discovered in 1803. That didn't get quite as much press. He said the Columbian Spring in Congress Park, a few rods from the Congress, is a fine chalybeate water, whatever that is, possessing singularly active properties in certain diseases and should be taken frequently in small quantities. Its effect when so taken is to strengthen and give tone to the stomach and increase the red particles in the blood. Full instructions for the use of this water can be had on application at the office opposite Congress Spring. So he's trying his best to impress people with these springs. And then there's Deer Park Spring, then and now, or now and then. Hasn't changed much, but you can see it's kind of needs a good scrubbing and a paint job and a plumber. Anyway, meanwhile, as time went on, Seneca Ray found more and more reasons to turn his attention increasingly northward, especially when he had acquired the ability to take high quality photographs of scenery and activities in remote places, leaving the tourist attractions of Saratoga and even Lake George behind, having built up a reliable supply of images and guidebooks to sustain those lucrative markets. He began making use of the newly expanding railroad to explore further afield up to the north. The Adirondacks beckoned, especially after the incredibly successful expansion of the Adirondack Railroad and the inspiration he felt while emulating Reverend Murray. He began using the Adirondack Railway. He wrote about it by saying, the Adirondack Railway, belonging to the D&H system, has its southern terminus at Saratoga and runs across the country through the hills to Corinth, thence up the valley, upper Hudson to North Creek, a distance of 57 miles. By this route, the Blue Mountain, Racket, and Long Lake regions of the Adirondacks are reached. Connections are made at Hadley with free carriages to the Luzerne hotels, at Riverside with coaches for Chestertown and Schroon Lake, and at North Creek with stages to Minerva and Blue Mountain Lake. Supplemental to the Adirondack Railroad and stage line to Blue Mountain Lake is the line of steam yachts, which run through Blue Mountain, Eagle, Utowana, and Racket Lakes with their connecting streams, affording one of the most delightful of excursions. And you can see the Ellingham is the name of the cruise ship in Schroon Lake. So as when he would travel into the Adirondacks, he took the train as far as it would go, and then he would ride the stagecoach along the Hudson up the North River Hill, as you can see here, the stagecoach on the left, to Blue Mountain Lake and beyond. Next. So Ray's travels up north revealed not only the natural beauty of the Adirondack wilderness, but also the degradation that was already becoming a serious concern due to primarily the lumber industry's clear-cutting vast areas of the forest along rivers where the flowing water was used to flush the logs downstream to the lumber mills in Glens Falls. So he was, these photographs are not artistic, but they're certainly very revealing of what's going on in the beautiful Adirondack Park. So you can imagine the chaos of those logs coming downstream. In fact, Have you ever noticed like the Hudson River in Glens Falls when they lower the water way down? Because I take my hornback boat out there and I paddle around, and you wouldn't believe the stuff I find on the bottom of the lake. I find old mason jars from the 1800s and Pepsi bottles from the 1940s and all kinds of stuff. And there's even a couple of sunken boats there. So you know, a lot of crap is on the bottom of the Hudson River. This image is very famous. It's called the Drowned Lands, and you can just read the mind of the guy sitting there. That's one of his guides, and he's like, "What a goddamn mess this is." This is what happens when they would build a dam, put the logs into the river, break down the dam, and the water it's like flushing a toilet. It just flushes all those logs down, and they rip everything off. This is supposed to be the shoreline of the Racket River up near Tupper Lake. I've paddled on that river, and thank God it doesn't look like that now. But it was just totally devastated, and that really pissed off Seneca Ray Stoddard. It looks like a nuclear blast had occurred there. So I think this really hit Stoddard very hard. So he also found himself useful to Verplanck Colvin, who was the gentleman with the derby hat or the straw hat, I guess, on the left in the tent there. He's the surveyor who did the survey of the Adirondack Park over many years. And Colvin could make maps, but he was not a photographer. And it occurred to him he needed a photographer to photograph the views of the Adirondacks, not only the one I just showed you, but some of the more attractive landscapes from mountaintops and so on. So Stoddard worked for the New York State Surveying Survey for a number of years, and he photographed this group here are the surveyors, some of Colvin's team of surveyors. And Stoddard was certainly by then very familiar with camping out with various people, hunters and friends and surveyors and other kinds of workers who happened to live in the and find work in the Adirondack Park. Next, he also photographed the hunters, including a very famous hunter. Let's see, Alva Dunning. Very good. That's Alva Dunning. Yep. He lived on Racket Lake, I think, on a little island on Racket Lake. He must have been quite a character. Stoddard photographed him a number of times. He photographed the fishermen. Yeah, I mean, where would they have gotten fish that big? I don't know if they're salmon or what they are, but they're really big. Probably not too many of them around today. Next. So he became not only the photographer for the surveyors, but he thought, well, while I'm at it, I'll learn how to make maps. And he became really good at it. Everything he ever learned how to do, he became really, really good at it. He made these incredible maps. Look at that map. Look at all the detail. He made that map himself. I think that's 1819 or something. But yeah, he would make and sell these maps for 50 cents. Yeah. Yeah, they're worth a little more than that now. So late in his career, his feelings about his passion for preserving the Adirondack Park was so intense that he felt that even though he was chronicling it with photographs and he was mapping it and he was showing the people trying to eke out a living and a survival in the Adirondacks, that wasn't enough for him after a while. Other dams were being built, including what would become the Great Sacandaga Lake, the Conklinville Dam, and the water industry was just making dams everywhere they possibly could because the city of New York needed a lot of fresh water. So these dams were actually made not so much for Adirondackers as it was for the people of New York City. So he began to fight the water industry, and he wrote editorials for newspapers, and eventually created his own magazine, which didn't have a very long lifespan, but in it he wrote many editorials. The picture on the left is the first issue of his magazine, and the second issue, and it changed over the years that it was in print, which wasn't very long. I think it was done with by 1911. But he had a lot of followers, and I think he reached a lot of people with this magazine that were rather passionate like him about preserving the Adirondacks and fighting the lumber barons and the dam builders and so on. In fact, you may know about his famous lecture in 1892. On February 25th, 1892, he showed 225 of his photographs on little glass slides to the New York State legislature. He projected these images onto a huge sheet in the downtown legislation building. 225 slides over three hours. And within 3 months, legislation was passed on May 20th, 1892, which created the Adirondack Park, 6 million acres.
Well, Verplank saw that coming and he really lobbies for it because also they realize all the trees are getting cut.
Yeah.
They need to save the trees for the water for New York City.
Right. So he wasn't just a photographer and an artist and a writer. He was an environmentalist when there wasn't even such a word, which is what I think is most impressive to me. He evolved, from this kid living with a crazy father and a crazy broken up home to learning how to paint like a master from artists in Troy as a teenager, maybe even a pre-teenager, to making banners in Glens Falls, to taking stereographs, to traveling up into the Adirondacks, to finding Verplank Calvin and being hired by him for the forest preserve protection. It's quite a timeline that he created for himself, and that's why I'm a kind of a Stoddard nerd myself. So this is the last known picture of Seneca Ray Stoddard. You may have seen it before. It's rather sad. There he is sitting in his chair. Emily Doty, his second wife, who was his lab technician before his first wife died. He married her eventually. I'm sure she was a caregiver as much as anything, at least toward the end. So that's his half brother, Frank. And they're puttering around with something. I don't know what, but he's got a drill in his hand. Frank's drilling something and God knows what. But you can see there's a lot in this picture. You can see the house behind him. And if you look at that, the white thing right there, yeah, that's where his darkroom was. He that panel there is a translucent panel that allowed enough light to pass through it. That's where he would lay his negatives and make his prints. Instead of using an enlarger, with an electric lamp, he used the sun, and that's where he did it. And the other half of the house is bedrooms and so on. But you can see there the yard is a mess. There's a big pile of firewood by that side door there, and it really is a scene of decrepitude. And I'm not sure exactly what year that was taken, but I think he he was becoming demented by then. He had Alzheimer's disease, and he ended up in a nursing house um, right like one block off of Glen Street on the other side. I could probably come up with an address if I thought hard enough, but he died there in 1917. So it's kind of a. I don't think so. I mean, his two sons grew up and made perfect names for themselves. His first son Charles was in the U.S. Army. He was a captain. I think he was a colonel actually. Eventually, he fought in the Spanish-American War. He was stationed in Cuba for a while, and he was a rather illustrious career Army man. His younger son became a plastic surgeon, and he married a very famous woman. I can't remember her name, but she was a singer of stage shows, and they were a beautiful couple, and they lived in New York City. And
It's just like after his death, you know, his contributions are recognized.
no, no. In fact, he was kind of forgotten about. You know, maybe it was because he had dementia for a number of years ago, and his sons didn't live in the area anymore. So he kind of slid into oblivion for a number of years. Luckily, his transparencies, his negatives, and so on survived, although probably not all of them by any means. He had a niece who Frank's daughter lived on this street.
Is that right?
Yes, she lived right on the street. Remember her name? Yeah, Ernestine. Thank you, Ernestine Stoddard. She was the last living descendant of Seneca Stoddard. I actually met her when she was very old. There was a plastic surgeon in Glens Falls who told me of her, and he said that she was the last living descendant of Stoddard. And he told me where she lived, and he said, you know, if you want, I can introduce you to her. So he set that up, and I went into her house in Bacon Street here, and she was very old, very frail. She had a couple of pictures. She had a portrait of him in a little frame, which she sold to me, and I bought a couple of stereographs and things from her. And I wanted to take her picture. I was already working on my first book, you know, and I wanted a picture of Ernestine Stoddard, but she wouldn't let me. But anyway, by then, Stoddard's stuff was in the basement of her house. Negatives and, you know, all this stuff just packed in this one place, and she was not interested in it in any way. So somehow Maitland DeSormo, who wrote this book, heard about her through, I think, the Glens Falls Historical Society, actually. And there's a description in here of how Maitland DeSormo met her, and he said, you know, I really want to make sure your great uncle's or uncle's material survives and is you know, taken care of. And so she and her I think forget if it was her niece or it wasn't her daughter, but her next generation descendant and her husband, I think their name was Philo. They found they connected with Maitland DeSormo and said, if you want this stuff, you can have it. He paid, I don't know how much he paid for it, but it was a modest fee. He had to borrow their station wagon to put the stuff in it. He had to and he lived in Saranac Lake. So he had to come down and fill the station wagon with as much stuff as he could possibly put in the car and drive up to Saranac Lake, put it in he bought a little store, And he put the stuff there, drove back to Glens Falls, filled the car up again. I think it took 5 trips to get all the stuff, cameras and everything, maps, negatives, you name it, stereographs. He took it all, and he saved it from probably demolition, or apparently some of these glass negatives, people are like, well, what do we do with these negatives? They would crush them into powder and use them as insulation in the walls of houses. So, so Maitland de Sormo did a very important thing. And of course, he also was a very clever guy. He started taking Stoddard stories and republishing them. And he was selling these maps, and he was selling photographs in his store. And so a lot of collectors started collecting them, and they got kind of spread around that way. And yeah, I think he was in an army originally, and then he was a gym teacher or something. But then he had enough talent and ambition and appreciation for Stoddard's work to turn it into a career for himself, and he saved Seneca Ray Stoddard's legacy. So let's see, what else do we have here?
So how do the museums get all this stuff? Because it's split between here and the Adirondack Experience, right?
Yes. Well, that's another story. I don't have their picture, but 2 of the members of this was the Glens Falls Historical Society, or it was called the Chapman Museum. My uncle was a member of the organization, and 2 men in the organization heard about de Sormo's collection, and I guess by then de Sormo had made his money from, he published everything he could publish, and he was running out of stuff. Maybe he was tired of sitting behind a table selling maps. So he said, I'd like to make sure this stuff gets a good home. So he contacted the Chapman Museum, he contacted the Adirondack Museum, and he said, who wants it? And so representatives from both museums got together with him, and they did a little horse trading and dickering and so on, and they decided to split the collection in half. So Chapman got half, and the Adirondack Museum got half. So these are the 2 places in the world where there is a sizable collection of Seneca Ray Stoddards. And that's why he's not, he's still noteworthy today, and is appreciated by the people of Glens Falls and the Adirondacks. So, okay, next picture. All right, so this is just, got a little side story here for you. So this picture I inherited from my grandfather. My great-grandfather, it was named James F. Garrett. He's the gentleman in the middle of the front row there. He had just come back from the Civil War. He was a captain in the Adirondack Regiment in the Civil War. Right before the Civil War started, he had bought a dental practice in 1860 from a dentist on Warren Street, and he was planning to become a dentist. Except the war started, and he volunteered and joined the Adirondack Regiment up in Elizabethtown, and was gone for 4 years or almost 5 years fighting in the Civil War. He almost got killed. He got shot with a mini ball that would have killed him, except that he had a canteen filled with either coffee or whiskey, depending on who he tells the story to. He got shot right in the canteen. It picked him up, knocked him into a ditch, cracked a couple of ribs, but he survived, and he brought home the canteen, which my cousin has to this day. We have the mini ball in the canteen. We also have his Spencer rifle. But anyway, he came back from Civil War. He had already bought a house on Elm Street in Glens Falls. And so he got married, and he started his dental practice, which he handed down to his son eventually, Walter Garrett, my grandfather. Walter handed it down to his son, Richard Garrett, my uncle, and my uncle handed it down to my cousin, Rick Garrett, who just retired a couple years ago. So almost over 100 years of dental practice in one family. So anyway, here's James Garrett, and he's in this group of people, and I believe he was about to get married. So this is some kind of a celebration with these other men. And I know who some of these men are. They're in-laws and relatives. But my grandfather made it, he made the effort to write down, and my father, James J.S. Garrett. But look who this is. It's S.R. Stoddard. And look how young he is. I'd say he's about 14 years old. And the question is, how did that happen? How did they know each other? And I don't know the answer to that, actually. Next. But I know that Seneca Ray Stoddard came from Wilton, which is the red square there. And my great-grandfather came from Ballston down here. And my great-grandfather's wife, Jenny Haight, H-A-I-G-H-T, came from, I forget which township that is, but it was near the green one, I think. So that's where the Haight family came from. And this is an amazing map. It's a little blurry, but it shows, this is some detail. This actually shows Dimmock Corners. Doesn't show Stoddard, the Stoddard name there, but there's the same Dimmock Corners that I showed you on that other map. And so I'm still tormented to this day by how the Stoddard, Seneca Ray Stoddard ended up my great-grandfather's picture. Next slide. Zooming in on the Ballston Spa part of the map, you can see there's a S. Garrett there, and a A.B. Garrett. That's Anson B. Garrett. That was my great-great-grandfather, and S. Garrett, Silas Garrett. So they lived there, and so I know that the Garretts, and they had come up from Kings County way back in the Revolutionary days. So they were long-standing residents of Saratoga County. And if you look at that same area today on Google Maps, look, there's Garrett Road and there's Garrett Lane. They're still there. And right up here is the cemetery. And there are 23 Garretts buried in that cemetery. But there are no Stoddards. No Stoddards. So go figure. Yeah, maybe. So anyway, getting kind of late, but just a couple more things here. Next slide. So these are all the books published about Seneca Ray Stoddard before mine came out anyway. So Disorma, as you can see, was the first one. And it took 10 years to have somebody else do another one. And that one was printed in celebration of a major exhibit at the Adirondack Museum. So that Seneca Ray Stoddard Adirondack Illustrator was published by the Adirondack Museum. And it's mostly pictures. There is some historical information, but then 5 years after that, Jean Winston Adler published her book, Early Days in the Adirondacks, and that's a magnificent book. She put a lot into that book, a lot of history. She did a lot of research. It's a great book if you really want to learn a lot of details about Stoddard's early history. She's the one who found the Dimmock's Corners and everything. Jeffrey Harrell came out 2 years later. Mark Bowie, a friend of mine and a fellow photographer, he did something that I love to do. He went in Stoddard's footsteps. He had every picture of Stoddard that Stoddard took, he would take the same view. I do that myself. In fact, I have a whole chapter in my book. Does anybody have my book? In my Stoddard book, I have a whole chapter where I followed in Stoddard's footsteps the same way, and you can see the two scenes next to each other.
In Ironville, which is up north,
Mhm.
they have, it's the Penfield Museum.
Mm-hmm.
an Eagle Scout did a trail not too far from there, and there is the picture Stoddard took. So you stand and it's on a pole, and it shows you where he stood to take the exact same picture. So you see it today, but you see it from where Stoddard
Yeah.
saw it. It's really cool.
Yeah, it is. It is very cool. If you take a look at my book on the way out, there's a whole chapter of those pictures. It's just a lot of fun to do that. You get this creepy feeling when you're like, you can feel his presence. And then the Chapman did their own book in 2017. Joe Cutchall King did a great job on that. A lot of Stoddard images in that book. And then PBS did a DVD a special on WMHT in 2006. I helped collaborate on that. I gave them some of my pictures to use. So that's where we're at. So this is the Garrett burial plot. And there's 23 names there, and they go way back. And I was hoping I'd find some Stoddards too, but there are none there. So, but of course, next slide. Everybody probably knows Seneca Ray is buried in the Pineview Cemetery in Glens Falls. There he is next to his wife, Emily, his second wife. The interesting thing is that it's just those two. His first wife was buried, she was a potter by her family name was Potter. And apparently her father was, as I told you, he was an insurance salesman, a lawyer. He was fairly well-to-do. He had already bought a plot in the Glens Falls Cemetery, which is on Bay Street. And so there's a big Potter monument there. And there's like 11 Potters buried there, including Augusta. And next to her is her son, Charles, was buried there. Nobody knows where the other son is buried. But Seneca Ray died 19 years before his second wife, Emily. But they both ended up together in the Pineview Cemetery. And on the left, you can see the Garretts are over in the Pineview Cemetery too. They're at the other end of it, but it looks like they both had the same idea. So you'll probably see some more Garretts show up there someday. So I think okay, I guess the last slide is my book. So I did a book using a different formula than the other authors. I instead of doing a timeline of his life, I kind of dissected him into his different qualities and talents and phases of his life and so on. So I talk about him as the artist, the photographer, the explorer, the map maker, so it's a different way of looking at him. And I think I wanted to cover some ground that hadn't been covered in other books. But I do have that chapter on his where I followed in his footsteps. I also have a chapter in there that he wrote a fictional piece for a newspaper that was very weird, and it clearly had to do with his temperance passion. It's about a man and a son who the man is a drinker. The son is trying to save his father, and it was somebody found it in a newspaper from the 1870s or 80s that Stoddard somehow had published, and it was tiny little print. I had to use a magnifying glass to read, what the text showed, but I was able to do that. So that is a chapter in my book, which makes me think that this was Stoddard's way. The funny thing is that unlike the real life, where his father was killed violently by a falling tree, and was probably drunk or something when he did that, this story ends happily, that the son goes out and defends his father's dignity, gets in a fight and so on, and the father is so impressed by his son's
heroism that he cleans up his act and lived happily ever after. So that there's that chapter in the book that nobody else has ever published. So anyway, if you're looking for some good reading and you don't already have my book, check it out.